And all right, thanks everyone for meeting today. Really excited to be having this discussion. Would everyone please be able to introduce themselves? So I think, David, you can go first.
Yep. Hi, I'm David Webber. I'm a head teacher of Amesbury Archer Primary School, a two-form entry mainstream community school in South Wiltshire.
Perfect. Amina, would you like to go next?
Yep, I am Amina. I'm an SEN mum, although I do have a experience of clinical research and a background in biochemistry. But more excitingly, I'm the co-founder of a neurodivergent support platform called Autumnly.
Lovely. And Smile, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, I'm Sumaya. I'm from Yorkshire, so very far away from you guys. I work in a secondary school with SEN and SEMH students, and I've very recently just co-founded Lumera, which is my own youth coaching business.
Amazing. Lovely. And yeah, my name's Ari. I'm neurodiverse myself. I've got ADHD, and I run the UK department for Vision for a tool called EFSim, which primarily looks at objective screening of executive functioning linked to ADHD. And our goal today was to talk about neuro-inclusivity because there's been a lot of talk around neurodiversity awareness and neurodiversity. And I think we've all seen the Instagram reels and TikToks around whether or not you have ADHD. But I think just as important is making sure that now that we're aware of this condition, how can we build environments that are inclusive of that? So I want to sort of pose a question to everyone. What does neuro-inclusivity mean to you? How do you view it?
I guess to me, it just means designing support that people can access, understand, and use without having to sort of change who they are just to
Mhm.
fit into it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
For me, I think it's that idea that everybody can access what they need, and that's the key kind of thing for me is that, neurodiversity, looking at how the brain functions, and then society adapting towards that in an inclusive way is really important. Demonstrating that tolerance and respect for each other that's so important and possibly lacking in some places of society currently.
Hmm. Inspire?
Yeah, I think I just echo Amina and David. It's all about inclusivity in terms of, being accepted in every way. I think what David mentioned about society is quite important. Me and Amina, we've had discussions regarding this. I think within society, within cultures, and we could go on about it forever, to be honest with you. But yeah, it's. I think as a whole, it's a topic that we can go on about. We can really talk on it for quite a long time.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for me also, I think we often think about inclusivity as like including a particular group, but I often would like to challenge us to think about that a lot of the times inclusion can benefit everybody. So, for example, like fidget spinners are great for people that have ADHD, but I'm sure a lot of other people would find it useful, or maybe turning like the lights down in certain places. I think most people find that beneficial. So, maybe thinking about it not just including specifically neurodiverse people, but how can this inclusion benefit everybody as well? Cool.
I think that's a really important point, Aaron, actually, that when we talk about inclusion, it is actually kind of more around the universal offer for everybody and how
Mhm.
everybody can succeed together rather than it being split out for certain groups.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also when we're trying to figure out how to build inclusive environments, I think one of the challenges is being able to identify who needs support, because it can be quite difficult to identify, yeah, who needs that support. Um, have you encountered challenges like that, David, within your school? Do you have that around first identifying, yeah, who needs that support?
Yep, definitely. Early identification is key. And I think we're a primary school, but I think it starts earlier than that. I think we work with nurseries, we work with parents, to try and work out if there are needs for children. I think the difficulty that you find in mainstream education is that it tends to be around dysregulation, and children being dysregulated is the first sign.
Mm,
We know children mask. That makes it very difficult for schools to sometimes recognize those needs. It's down to relationships, so making sure that the adults in schools know the children, that the schools are listening to parents, um, and making sure that there is a culture, certainly within my school, and I think it should be across all schools, that the diagnosis doesn't matter. It's around the needs of the child. Because I think currently there is a feeling that when you get the diagnosis, that is going to solve the problems. Everybody's going to suddenly sit up and listen and say, oh, they've got that, so then we need to do that. It shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that we have to prove that a child has additional needs. We should already be looking at what does that child need that will make sure that they can be regulated and then access the curriculum, the classroom, calm, calmer spaces at home potentially, and just be able to live a life that's full of joy, love, and just enjoy the world around them rather than us focus on having a diagnosis or have we got enough evidence to prove
Mm.
that a child has a label which actually isn't needed. And I think schools can do a lot of very good work at looking at what are the needs of the child and making sure that their universal offer across those four main areas of need is already doing a lot of the heavy lifting. That means that children don't require a diagnosis to get access, kind of as a gatekeeper to the provision that they need. It should just be there and allowed in all schools and all classrooms for them to be able to access learning and life. And then that also would alleviate some of the pressure on more of the specialist settings. When universal offers are implemented properly, early identification can happen from, nursery all the way through. And actually, when that identification happens, if the universal offer then isn't meeting things, it gives those options on where then they can go on to. Whereas at the moment, I think there's too much around having to prove that a child has needs, schools being pitted against local authorities and against parents, rather than it all kind of working together to say, what does this child need?
Mhm.
A diagnosis might help, but equally, if there's a sensory need, what can already be put in place to minimize that barrier, remove those
Mhm.
barriers to learning.
Yeah,
And I
no,
think for parents as well, for parents and carers, just letting them know that they can support a child prior to diagnosis, that they don't have to wait for the diagnosis for support to be in place. Because it took a while for us, for example, my daughter was, I think, 5 when she was diagnosed, but we knew that she had these needs from the age about probably 17, 18 months. So we had to implement things and put things in place. So yeah, it's not just about the diagnosis. I think the needs sometimes are evident before a diagnosis, and there are things that you can do. You don't have to wait for that diagnosis.
yeah, and I think also in society we have a very sort of like medical view a lot of the time where it's like there's a
Yeah.
disease and then there's a diagnosis and there's a cure. But
Yeah.
with mental health and neurodiversity especially, there isn't always a cure. Like it's
Mm.
I mean, I know that there's medication for ADHD, but it's not effective for everybody.
Mm.
And the therapy is support, but obviously you could provide that to anybody without. And I
Yeah.
do think that a lot of like those strategies around executive functioning support, for example, would benefit every child, not just children with ADHD.
And
I
that
agree.
takes a
Yeah.
bit of a culture change, Ari, in schools, I think. That's
Hmm.
where it has to be that idea that we can do things for everybody. And it
Hmm.
doesn't have to be, that universal offer should be quite extensive in a mainstream school to meet the needs of learners and society nowadays.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, David, I mean, just sharing as somebody who's also in the education, but also with lived experience with my own son, do you think there is a gap between the identification and the access?
Definitely.
In the school itself, we're not talking about the medical diagnosis, but I think it was a couple of days ago, I put a post out on LinkedIn. It was just my thoughts, really, is because working in schools, you're in primary. I'm in secondary, I've done primary as well. But there's always lots of progression assessment, but there's that lack of identification and we don't know where that gap is. It's quite strange because when we talk about, assessments, we're assessing them and assessing their progression and development, right from preschool. But for some reason, the identification isn't coming till very late on, and they're not getting the access that they need till very late on. I mean, when I working in secondary, and we can see the signs when a student will come in, in year seven. I can say I can see this student is such, such, and such, but for some reason, it's not way down the line that they're getting the access or getting what they need. If I talk about my own son, I knew as a mum all along that there was something there. He needed the extra support. He needed the extra help. It wasn't until he left school, sat his GCSEs, and finished his GCSEs that I did a private assessment, and we found out that he was neurodivergent and he's dyslexic and he's got Erling syndrome. But he had no support throughout.
And I think that's the difficulty with the current system is the diagnosis becomes the gatekeeper to funding.
Hmm.
And it's the funding element that is the biggest barrier to children getting what they need. Now, as a school leader, I am driven and motivated to providing for all of the needs of the children in my school. And so our investment is in making sure that they are able to access that. We are a school that has an average number of pupil premium children. We have some forces children as well. And the SEND funding doesn't go far enough to meet the needs of the children that I have. So we are supplementing that from the school budget because it's something that I'm passionate about. In a smaller school, I'm not sure how easy that is to be able to facilitate all of a child's needs. And so then it's around needing the identification to get access to funding. You need to have expertise on the ground. I think that's one of the key issues that you find in schools is that a school like mine has a range of staff that have varied experience of children with SEND and being able to identify. As professionals working in the education system, we've probably been in it for a little while now, so we have that experience of children. But I know when I started 12, 13 years ago, I didn't fight for children to get an EHCP because I felt that I could meet their needs because I wanted to meet their needs, which also actually has a negative impact on the child. And inclusion can be done completely with love and with care that actually isn't in the best interests of the child. And that's something that I'm certainly learning as a head teacher is that there is a place for specialist provision that maybe 4 years ago I didn't really believe in. I thought everybody should be a mainstream, but it's not in the best interest of the child. The sad reality is it's that funding. It's all about money and making sure that children can access that. And I think that's where, for us, something like EFSim is really useful as a tool because not only, and I'm sure Ari, you'll talk about this in a minute, but not only is there the support for the school and for the parents in the strategy so that the child benefits, there's also the medical side that can support the diagnoses and kind of get past that block, that barrier to the funding that's required.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, yeah, I fully agree. And I definitely agree that like early identification is just so, so important. And our hope with EFSim is also with our reports to support the submission of those EHC plans to then help the schools secure further funding, ideally. But yeah, I think it might be helpful if I talk a little bit about how EFSim functions. So I've got some slides that talk about how the tool works. Let me just pull that up because I think it'll help kind of bring a lot of this into context as well. 1 second. All right, is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes.
There we go. Perfect. So yeah, similarly to what we were talking earlier, our goal is that early detection and intervention just as soon as possible. And there's so many digital apps out there that focus primarily on like ADHD assessment or mental health assessments. And on our end, we do some of that, but primarily what we care about is executive functioning, which essentially is a set of cognitive skills that help individuals manage and regulate their day-to-day emotions and day-to-day tasks. And I think it's really important because, like, I've got ADHD, and the things that affect me aren't my ADHD, it's my poor executive functioning. It's the time management or difficulty with memory. The hyper-focus symptoms of ADHD I find are actually incredibly helpful for me in my job because it means I can focus on projects for hours at a time. And the issue with trying to assess executive functioning is that it's very subjective. So an individual may not be aware that they might struggle with time management or perhaps working memory. And also, a lot of us will have workarounds, like the kid that hides all of their messy papers in their backpack, or someone who like takes notes all the time to hide their poor memory. It's very easy for us to develop skills to hide it rather than actually cope with it. So what we wanted to evaluate was essentially create a digital simulation that evaluates executive functioning in real time. So essentially, we've got this game where there's an avatar called Laura. For older kids, we've got a male avatar named Vincent. And essentially, they're in this home environment and the avatar gives them a list of tasks to do. So the avatar might say, you need to put your clothes away, wash your face, call your dad at 2 p.m., put some soup on the stove. And the child navigates around this virtual environment, completing all of those different tasks. And as they complete the task, the game evaluates them on a wide variety of parameters. So we look at, are they getting distracted with the toys that are scattered around the room? Are they able to organize the tasks efficiently in their mind? Are they struggling with time management? Do they get lost when they're navigating around the room? And all of that feeds into our neurological performance indicators. So again, we look at how many tasks they've completed, which is the total score. We look at how efficiently they're able to complete the tasks, how well they're able to organize it in their mind. Interestingly enough, task efficacy is our biggest predictor of ADHD because, as I mentioned, you can have poor executive functioning, but not in a way that it relates to ADHD. Someone with difficulty with time management may not necessarily have ADHD. And in Finland, we've seen that 20% of the children we've evaluated had some kind of executive dysfunction. But for most, it was mild. Most of them would not meet criteria for ADHD. But I do think it's still helpful to assess them. I think also we think about ADHD as a sort of like black and white thing, like you either have it or you don't. But ADHD and executive functioning exists on a spectrum, and all of us can have a day where we have poor executive functioning if we don't get enough sleep, if we're tired, if we're traumatized or stressed. And so a child that may not meet criteria for it at one point may meet criteria for it later. And I think that's why it's important to not look at it as a black and white thing, but to look at it as more of a spectrum. And so these neurological indicators feed into different categories of executive functioning. So we look at inattention and general executive functioning, hyperactivity and impulsivity, and then also planning and perspective memory. And at the end, we do show the likelihood of ADHD because it is important. But the most important thing, I think, is the categories of where exactly is this child struggling. So here you can see that the child is likely to have ADHD. They are primarily struggling with attention and they're a little hyperactive. And that means that if you're a parent or a teacher, you now know what specifically to focus on. And then in addition to these clinical reports, we then have the parent reports with the strategies and techniques that David was mentioning previously. And I think that's really helpful because instead of just labeling the child, you now have a what then or what to do about it. And these reports are the same for the parents and the teachers, which helps improve communication because everyone's using the same language. And we've also been seeing that our reports tend to be used for HCB plans. So generally, if there's concern about a child, the SENCO will assess the child with EFSim, which takes 25 minutes. And then they'll take the reports and attach them as additional evidence for HCP plans or further referrals. And something that we've heard from some of the schools is that sometimes when they submit an HCB plan, it can get rejected if there's not enough information or conflicting information, and resubmitting it takes quite a bit of time. But so far, it seems that EFSim tends to decrease the chances that that happens. I don't know, have you used EFSim to submit HC plans yet, David?
Not yet. They are sitting alongside two that we've put in recently, so I'll be able to let you know the success rate.
Okay, perfect. But yeah, we know that I don't want to like be over promising and saying that EFSim can speed up the whole process because I also don't know if we want clinicians making quicker decisions about where a child should go. But at the very least, we can keep a process functioning the way that it should, which still I think saves quite a bit of time. And so essentially, as I mentioned, it takes a minute to create the credentials, 25 minutes to play the game. You get the results automatically. So in half an hour, you're able to provide support for a child. And yeah, that is a quick summary of EFSim. I think one thing that's important to also note is that our most recent clinical trial did show that EFSim can reliably distinguish between kids that have ADHD and typically developing children, and also that they find it fun to use, which I know clinically doesn't matter, but practically when you're dealing with hyperactive children, I think it matters. And I also think, especially as kids get older, it's so easy for them to disengage and just sort of get through an assessment rather than actually engaging with it. And I think that is really, really important. But yeah, the other thing that I wanted to also talk about is I think it's helpful to have EFSim in a school, but that's only one part of the pathway because the child then after school goes to the family. And our reports are helpful in terms of the strategies and techniques, but one thing that we're working to do is just be able to signpost better to other people within the system. And I think that goes well to Autimly. So, I mean, do you want to talk about Autimly a bit?
Yeah, so I'm working on Autumnly, which essentially it's a neurodivergent support platform for children and for adults. And I guess we focus on three key principles. One is education, so just providing that awareness to people. Number two is access to neurodivergent affirming specialists. So we only partner with professionals who have that deep understanding of neurodivergence and who are neuro inclusive. And three, it's also about well, three and four, it's also about economic accessibility. We're quite passionate about providing different formats, because sometimes you do want to see professionals and there'll be really expensive consultations and assessments and things like that. So we want to get rid of that barrier and that friction to support. And also, we want to provide community as well, because I think a lot of the time people need a space to connect, whether they're parents and carers or whether they're neurodivergent adults. So essentially, we want to be that central hub because I think in these demographics, we're kind of already very overwhelmed trying to navigate really complex systems. And then when you have to go out of your way to find the right support, it just adds an extra burden. And sometimes in the past, it has put me off looking for something because I'm overwhelmed. I'm having to guess, I'm having to Google, go to group chats. So yeah. And another thing I think I wanted to mention is that a lot of the professionals who are providing services on the platform are neurodivergent themselves. So, alongside that clinical expertise, they've got that lived experience understanding. And that's very important for me because it helps support feel more validating sometimes and more relatable and more real. Um, so just back to the education, we want to make education really digestible because I think when I talk about awareness, if we want to bring that awareness piece, more people have to be able to access basic information. So we want to do video formats, simple video content, and we also don't believe that anything is too taboo. I think I was speaking to Samaya about that. We want to take that stigma away because there are a lot of topics that people kind of shy away from. And that's definitely a focus for us on the platform. And when it comes to support, for me, when my daughter was diagnosed, I don't think anybody really explained things that might help. It was very much, these are her difficulties, this is the diagnosis, speech and language might help. But I don't think it's that simple. I think where we are now, we kind of need to understand the emotional side of things, the day-to-day realities for children and for caregivers and adults. And we want to support the overall well-being of people, whether that's mental health support and things like that, or just having a space to talk to someone. So we're looking at everything a bit more holistically. Um, Also, I've just found that there are so many incredible practitioners. So it can be from clinical services, but to creative therapies as well. Because I've used play therapy for my daughter, and there's these really cool OT approaches. I'm not sure if anybody's heard of floor time. It's one where you kind of, you've heard about floor time. It's like a play-based approach, but it emphasizes regulation and connection. And it really provides the foundation for learning. And I've met really interesting people providing these services, but sometimes you can't find these things, and people don't know they're out there. And we talk about early intervention all the time, but it's like, why does nobody kind of sit down with a parent and say, this might help, occupational therapy is really important for your child. Dysregulation might look like this. So we want to provide that guidance for people, letting them know what's out there in terms of help and just connecting them to people. Like I said, we do group sessions and workshops, but also just a membership for anybody that's coming into this and they're overwhelmed. It's like it's affordable, but we also just want to give that clarity and take that journey with somebody and provide that personalized support. And this all comes from the gaps that I found. I mean, my daughter's 9 now, but I learned things through trial and error and through a random recommendation on a Thursday that somebody told me. And if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have known. And I could have saved myself a lot of hardship, and I could have, saved my daughter a lot of hardship as well, had I known. Um, so yeah, that's a big piece for me is just helping people because you can keep mentioning early intervention a million times, but nobody's holding anyone's hand and saying this is what early intervention looks like. And because we're talking about ADHD today, I think my daughter has ADHD, but children with ADHD sometimes need support with a range of things related to the ADHD. Some things that may be related to even being in the school environment and learning. So, like Samaya, she focuses on things like confidence and self-esteem. She's a youth coach, and I think that is not spoken about enough, how valuable that is. Although she does sort of one-to-one sessions with children, she also does group sessions as well, which adds that valuable layer of peer support. And I think people could really benefit from that. And again, it's a mental health side of it as well. Support with anxiety, maybe emotional regulation, and you've got therapists, you've got brilliant psychologists who adapt their approaches to support neurodivergent children. Um, Sometimes parents might be looking for specialist tutors who can really break things down and adapt that learning, which is something my daughter needed, and kind of support her in a way where she's able to actually process information. Um, so yeah, I think accessing education is really important because when you're not able to access that information and you don't have those personalized strategies in place, it can be really challenging and that can have negative outcomes on mental health and just a range of different things. And like I said, I think like those needs obviously don't disappear, they kind of evolve in adulthood. And I've noticed like, yes, it's all early intervention, but what about support with work or support with relationships or learning how to advocate for yourself? So these are really important factors. And I have, through LinkedIn and just connections that I've made, met really important people that are doing so much work and they're just not meeting people who would benefit from that support. Um, and so, yeah, you can access consultations through our platform. Sometimes you just want one-off advice. I've wanted advice on things like toileting sometimes, but I don't want a full assessment and this. I just need a quick 20, 30-minute chat with an occupational therapist. What do you think? Provide some strategies for me. And there are people that are offering those flexible formats. So I just want to bring that to the platform. Um, and yeah, our platform's going to be live in July, but we are already providing people with support. When they join the waiting list, we contact them directly to ask what they would need support with. And sometimes people just email us, so you can signpost them to our website, which is www.autimly.com, or just email us admin@autimly.com. And yeah, and I think because we're talking about schools today, I think outcomes are a lot stronger when parents and schools are having that really good communication and that understanding, and there's an air of like openness as well. Um, and so if there are gaps or concerns, we can kind of help bridge that gap because many of the people I work with have been in similar positions. They've got that lived experience. So we're just there for that, really. And yeah, I think I didn't mention I've spoken to parents who are so desperate to help their children that they'll do these therapies and they'll end up in, I guess, in situations where somebody's charging these extortionate fees for these therapies and claiming to fix their children and stuff. So we need that accountability layer as well. So a purpose of the platform is for anybody to come and say, sense check things and what do you think about this? And you just make sure no one's falling into those kind of traps because yeah, the stories out here are quite concerning. So that was another purpose for me. But yeah, I think that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And I really think that being able to give people just so much more personalized support, because do you
Yeah.
feel like sometimes parents don't really know what to ask?
Yeah, I feel like parents, even for myself, like you don't, like I said, I learned through trial and error. At the beginning, you don't have that knowledge, you don't have that information. You kind of have to become a researcher yourself. But because you're already navigating a lot of complex things already, it takes time to get to a level where you start having that understanding of, okay, she might need support with this. It doesn't just come out of the blue, you don't just have all that information. And I think that's an issue because the earlier you understand these things, the better the outcomes. So for me, I guess it was about guiding people early on so they don't have to either burden themselves with having to do so much consistent research and wait years till they get to a position where they're able to help their child. But yeah, I think, yeah, you don't just become a professional overnight. It takes time. But if you do have somebody kind of holding your hand through that and explaining really basic principles to you, it helps.
And I think also sometimes parents, I think David, you mentioned this earlier, that there's an adversarial environment where it's
Yeah.
sort of like schools are pitted against, like parents are pitted against schools, which are pitted against local authorities, and everyone's kind of fighting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Have you found ways to how have you found ways to manage that, David, on your end as someone working within a school?
I think it's a real challenge, to be honest, because I think a lot of um, parents of neurodiverse children have their own experiences of school. They may be neurodiverse themselves. They may not have been positive experiences. So
Mhm.
therefore, and neurodiversity wasn't really understood properly, and it was a kind of there was one size fits all approach, which just isn't going to work. It's not like that now. I'm sure there are still some schools that maybe are still a little bit stuck there, but I think I've not met anybody that works in education who is not invested in making sure that children can access education, that everybody is in it to try and do the best for the child. The best thing that is that open, honest, transparent conversations. The difficulty, as Amina has been saying, is that actually a lot of schools don't know what's out there either. And that's part of the problem is that both Samaya and myself will have gained a lot of experience over the time that we've been in education, but we're still learning as well. EFSim, we came across, I think, last year. Previous to that, we haven't got access to it. But I know that when I talk to parents at school, there's still a sense of um, that they are being told to fight and that they need to
Mhm.
fight for their child. And I always want parents to advocate for their child. I think it's really important they do know their child the best. Sometimes schools can believe that we know the child better or we see them in a different way or in a different environment, but the parent always knows and the parent should always
Mhm.
stick with their gut feel. I think for me, it's that idea of having to fight the school. It needs to be collaborative. If you ever get into a disagreement or confrontation, we talk to the children about this as well, the outcomes from aggression or kind of that needing to want more, shout loudest gets it, doesn't really work. It doesn't benefit everybody. And it means that there's that bad feeling around schools end up thinking, oh, well, I've got to do it because the parent wants me to do it rather than the child needs this. And I think that's where it needs to start. The early identification, early communication with parents around this is what we're seeing at school. Does that match with what you see at home? And then looking at whether if it doesn't match, why might it not match? Having what we call professional curiosity to try and work out why is it different? What is it that that child needs? Um, and then working together with the local authority, with the external agencies to say, this is what we know is out there. The parent can go away and do their research. And it's something that I'm really hopeful with the SEN reforms that are coming in. I know it's going to take a little bit of time for everything that happens with the white paper. But the idea of experts at hand that we can go to and say, this is the child, this is how they present. What are the suggestions around those strategies and being able to do that earlier? Um, because at the moment, the idea is that we have to prove that there is a need. And that's
Mhm.
what we need to get away from because the parents know there's a need. The school know there's a need. If the school aren't seeing the need, frankly, schools need to listen to parents and accept that there is and look at what support can be put in place for that child and take it seriously with that professional curiosity. And then LAs need to trust their schools to be able to say, we support this parent in this child's needs. And I think that's the difficulty because at the moment there isn't consistently across the board a culture or a climate that's based on positivity and nurture. It's still a little bit of labels and funding and all that sort of stuff. And that's where it really shouldn't matter. We need to be very much child focused, building those secure relationships, not just with the child, but also with the parents, because ultimately that parent is going to be the person that will advocate them when they move to the next school or has already been advocating for them at the previous school. And ultimately we're all professionals. So if a parent isn't happy with what we're doing, we have to accept that and try and show that we are invested in the child and what we're trying to do. Because at a primary school, we take children from 4 to 11. From 11 onwards, they're going to a secondary school. I have no control over what the provision looks like, what they're going to get. So I need to make sure that I've been able to evidence everything and show what we're doing so that then the secondary school don't say, okay, let's, take a backward step. That child then will be much more successful with the parent being able to say, well, actually, we've done that previously. That did work. That didn't work. Maybe that would work now, because I think we've got to be careful that we don't discount things when it doesn't work one week. It's worked for a little bit, then it doesn't. We can't just go, all right, let's get rid of that. And that, again, kind of bringing it back to EFSim is where these parental reports and the strategies really support with that, because there is the written evidence
Mm.
of what a school has tried. That parent is doing it at home. And I think that's the other thing that we need to accept is that when a child has a neurodiverse need, there still needs to be boundaries. There does need to be support for the child, but that needs to be at school and at home. And if they can be consistent, that means that there's less dysregulation for the child. And that's where working together really does support the
Yeah,
child fully.
absolutely. And I think sometimes with neurodiversity, it's really easy to I think sometimes it's easy to be a bit defeatist about it, to just kind of be like, oh, I've got ADHD, so therefore I can't focus. But I think it's so important to still, yeah, to have that sort of self-management and and support to still be able to do the things. So like how can we accommodate you to still be able to function in the day-to-day life, if that makes sense?
I think supporting a child that knows that they have a diagnosis and talking to there's a couple of children today that I was talking to, and they don't necessarily hide behind the diagnosis, but there is well, I did this because I have ADHD. That there's a bit of a misunderstanding for the child in what their diagnosis means, and so they believe that that gives them allowance to behave in a way that society wouldn't accept and school doesn't accept. And for us as educators, it's around saying, no, no, you have needs. Look at the provision that we're putting in place that's to help you, but we need to help you to be able to have a successful life. ADHD is not who you are. You are much more than a diagnosis, and you do have some control even with ADHD or autism, that you are able to still have control over your life and make
Mm.
decisions on what you need to do. And actually, schools and parents at home are trying to support and guide children through that development and their understanding, as well
Mm.
as us as adults trying to work it all out with them
Yeah.
and hopefully with them and not just for them.
I also find that sometimes with families that have neurodiverse kids, because it's often genetic, that sometimes parents struggle to see it because they themselves are neurodiverse. So they're like, well, that's normal. And also, I have encountered a couple situations where the parents did not receive accommodations. So therefore, they're like, well, why does my child need this? Because I did not get that. Have you encountered that, David? And how would you suggest addressing that sort of pushback?
Yeah, I think a lot of we definitely see that. I think again, it's coming back to education has changed. We understand child development much more. We understand the human brain a lot more, and in another 10 years' time, another 20 years' time, we'll be even further forward. And I would imagine that, we'll be in the same position maybe as grandparents. We'll be looking at our grandchild and thinking, oh, well, we didn't have that in our day. And it's that sort of thing that we can't let that stop progress. Um, I think there's also the idea that because somebody didn't have it previously, they shouldn't have it now. We've got to get past that. If a child needs it, they need to be able to just have it, I think is what I would be saying. And parents, I think schools just have to be understanding that parents' lived experience may have been different. As a school, we have a range of staff. Um, I was talking to one today. They did not have a great experience at school, but they have become a teacher. They wanted to change that for children. I had a wonderful education and really enjoyed school. So actually, within our own institutions, we've got a variety of kind of lived experiences of school, and we've all kind of come together for the same reason, that we want to make education as positive as we can for children. Trying to instill that into parents and saying, look, we do have your best interest is really difficult. And it's just going back to look at the success that we've had, look at this is what we can do. These are the places that we can signpost you to, talk to parents of children that have previously been in the school. You know which schools have good reputations for children with SEND or different needs. You also know which schools don't, but you can't take that as written because leadership teams change, staff change, and schools are all working towards being more inclusive. And so that reputation is one that you'll know if you visit the school. That's the other thing is don't just accept phone calls as a neurodiverse parent. Get into the school, ask for a tour. I can't, if a school is saying that you can't come in and have a look at what the provision is, that would be quite a red flag for me, because
Mm.
I think schools need to be open about what they're doing and should be proud. All schools should be proud to show what they are doing and shouting quite loudly around this is what you could have if it's needed. Um, but it's very much in the schools kind of court to make that effort to convince the parent that we are the best place for the child. And speaking from my own experience, I can't say I've always got that right. It
Mm.
isn't, sometimes I've said the wrong thing. I've said, I've made comments that have been misinterpreted or don't land well. Because also schools sometimes have to give difficult messages as well, that actually in our professional judgment, we don't feel that that provision would be right. Whereas a parent may have received advice or heard about, we were talking about floor time, a kind of creative therapy. It's not something I've heard of. So a parent coming and asking me for that is something where I'd have, I'd be saying, well, I need to look into that. I may not be able to provide that now. We may not have a provider. That feels to some parents that we're rejecting their
Mm.
suggestion rather than
Mm.
us being able to look into it and see if it's there. And then we kind of get into the talk around postcode lotteries and what's the provision in your local areas and all that sort of stuff. But I think making sure that there is personalized support, focusing on
Mm.
the emotional side of things for both the children and the family, um, because ultimately that is what we want, is secure relationships. And if we get on well with the parents, then the child will get the provision they need. But it's a two-way street, that we need to get away from this. Parents have to fight schools to get what they want, and
Mhm.
schools have to be open to listening to parents. It's very much two-way.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are some things that, because I know you said that it sounds like EFSim's working quite well. What are some other things that you wish, like, if we look at the future, what kind of support do you wish you would have? Or how, if you're thinking about like your ideal classroom, for example, what things would you like within it, if that makes sense?
I think it's very much around a level playing field for schools, making sure that all schools have access to the same provision, resources, funding, that the screeners that are available, things we've already mentioned dyslexia, I think, is another area earlier on, that that there is a way that when a child can be screened for dyslexia, what are the strategies that come off the back of that? I think um, again, it's kind of it's not waiting for the diagnosis.
Mhm.
What EFSim does really well is it gives us those strategies for a child that has executive function difficulties that we can put in place immediately while there are other processes going on. And that, I think, for all areas of neurodiversity would be really useful as a school. We've got children that have Tourette's, but nobody within our staff team has kind of the expertise to be able to address that. So we're having to play catch up for that. The parents are very supportive, but it makes it really difficult when we can't say, right, here are the strategies that this child needs, because then that the child is dysregulated, the disruption happens. I said, um, to some of you previously, inclusion is what all schools want. And a lot of parents will be positive about inclusion until it's affecting them, certainly in mainstream, affecting their child. And that's where it becomes difficult. And then there's parental conflict between parents, and then those parents coming into the school and everybody getting caught in the middle. So I think anything that means that children can be more regulated, accessing their needs, that's the ideal. Um, Making sure that we have training, a CPD package for staff that not only kind of addresses general needs, because we're talking about children with ADHD. That is a huge spectrum of need and individual kind of support that's required there. Um, and being able to have tools that really nail down what it is that these children need so that they can be successful sooner. The fact that some children are getting into secondary school and their needs are not being met, that's a long time in education for them to have not been identified or supported to access the curriculum. You're not going to be able to be as successful as you could be if it's not earlier. And that's the key, is being able that as soon as a child is falling behind, or their parents are saying we don't think it's quite right, they're not reaching their potential, that's when schools need to be listening and saying okay. Because I think the other danger is that when schools are judged on outcomes and attainment, and Ofsted ratings, I, it's around how do we make sure that we don't put a limit on their ambition too. Because I think a child with ADHD as a label for any member of a school community, that suddenly means, oh, well, they might not be able to do everything. And a label of autism or dyslexia, suddenly there's that kind of feeling of, oh, well, maybe they won't get there. But actually, there's no reason why they can't, with the right scaffolds, the right support that's in place. And I think that's the big push. Um, you said about an ideal classroom. I think something that makes sure that inclusion is incentivized, that we are really making sure that the schools that are inclusive and trying their best to make sure that they are doing what they can for children is rewarded and not negatively affected.
Mm-hmm.
Data outcomes, Ofsted ratings, parental surveys, recommendations, all of that needs to be based around how inclusive a school is and not around whether their outcomes are, 85%, whether they're above national or not. Nationally, we've got a whole load of SEND kids. If they are being put into some schools that are doing inclusion well, that system will break. It needs to be equitable, that all schools can function well, and that it isn't a data-driven activity. No child should be data or purely data.
I definitely agree, especially about the incentivization, because I think it's so easy for outcomes to be constructed in a way that doesn't really reflect the full picture. And I think it's so challenging because I think, yeah, there's been a lot of talk in the ICBs about services having just incorrect outcomes. I'm wondering how inclusion could be measured. And I'm wondering if that could be through like student satisfaction reports or parents. Does anyone have any thoughts on how we could potentially measure inclusion for schools? Because I think it's such an interesting thought.
I think that idea, David really well touched up on the relationship between the parents and the school being, collaborative, because I'm sure David comes across it a lot as well, is we can have parents that, collaborate really well, and, they'll know that, and they'll understand that, okay, the school is seeing my child in a different light than what we do at home. But then you can get the complete opposite. And then there's these expectations from parents that schools should be doing certain things, or this and this, and why is the school not doing this, because my child is not like this at home, etc., etc. So I think collaboration is really important. But if we look at inclusivity in as a whole, like, it's a big thing, because I think I say this quite often. In an ideal world, every school would have an educational psychologist.
Mm.
That would really help, because that not that doesn't just help with the academic side, it would also help with the mental health and the well-being side of students. But that aside, I think, and I'm sure David will agree, there is still a huge, I don't want to say lack of training, but I think that's what it points down to, lack of training when it comes to the support workers, lack of training even as teachers, because we know teachers do not get trained specifically. And I know we've had this conversation with Amina previously. They don't have, my daughters are teachers. I know that they don't have specific SEN training when they are going through the teacher training. And I think we're in a world now where, because neurodiversity, we're in a time now when neurodiversity is obviously on the rise. There is more awareness. We do know more about it, and it is evolving, just like David says. And I think that training is very important for inclusion to work the way that we expect it to.
Yeah, no, I agree. EFSim actually has started doing webinars and trainings on executive functioning to schools just as part of their subscription with us, where if they roll out EFSim and they're nervous about teachers maybe not understanding executive functioning, we've been providing that. And we find that
Yeah,
really, really helps. Because I think, yeah, if we take away the sort of inner conflict, if most people want to help, most people want to understand. I think it can just be kind of scary to
yeah.
admit if you don't know something.
That's it.
Yeah.
It's just that they just don't know how. I mean, I can tell you examples and stories that I go through every day, but if we put the academic to aside, even the holistic, because once a child gets, especially a neurodivergent student, once they get dysregulated, it's very difficult. One strategy might work with one, it's not going to work with the other. I mean, if I particularly focus on one student now, I had a student who was my key student, and he was year 9 at the time, and he was autistic, but he was mental health wise, he was at crisis point. He did not want to live completely point blank. And it's like, what do we do? Because mom can't cope at home. She's sending him to school early, leaving him till the last one at school. It got to a point where he didn't even want to go home. So he used to be team teached out at 5 o'clock. So we were staying behind till 5 o'clock to try and regulate him. But nobody, and we're talking, senior leaders, head teacher, nobody knew how to holistically help him regulate. I mean, I was quite lucky. He was my key student, and I've got a background of also chaplaincy and counseling. So I was able to build that rapport with him to this point where I knew what he needed at that time. Sometimes all he wanted was him sitting there crying and me sitting there on the floor with him,
Mhm.
Mm.
and that would regulate him. And that's all he wanted. But it was because there was this expectation from home, there was this expectation from school. It was all too much. He wasn't fitting into school, and it was all too much. But like I said, and then carrying him out, so two senior leaders carrying him out, him being team teach to the point where he's been carried out through school, so he's been looked at, into the car, so he's looked at. It had an adverse effect on him. Whereas holistically, things could have been done very differently, but that training wasn't there for that to happen. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about SEMH when it comes to SEND as well, because it's a whole big topic in itself, and it matters. It matters a lot. I see it with my own son. I mean, I've got three, but my son, he's potentially, I mean, we're waiting, but I think he could be ADHD, although he's got, dyslexia and stuff. He could be ADHD, and I can see it because his mental health can be completely point blank, and the next day he could be fine. My other two don't always understand how he functions, how he does things, and it's constantly me telling them, because obviously they're not taught this at school. So it's me saying to them, no, his brain works differently, whereas, and I have to say to them, chemically, his brain works differently, not, and that's the only way they'll understand it, because they don't know about it. They've never heard about it.
Mm.
Even my daughter being a teacher, she doesn't know how neurodiversity in itself works. So it's difficult.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I think it's that awareness as well. Like what you were
Definitely.
doing with him, just sitting on the floor with him, that's
Mm.
co-regulation. You're helping him regulate his emotions by you remaining regulated, and he's like borrowing from your nervous system, but that's a strategy in itself, but not everybody will have that understanding. And if particularly parents don't have that understanding at home, that can lead to a lot of challenges for that
Yeah,
child. And there are still
yeah,
parents who see it as discipline sometimes as well, as the child is trying to
that's
be
it.
capable.
Yeah, exactly.
That
I
can have
think
huge.
demanding
Mhm.
when a child, especially a neurodiverse child, when they're dysregulated, the last thing that you can do is demand them to do
Yeah.
something. You know, you
Mm.
have to do this or you have to do that's only going, but this is again the awareness and the lack of training, that's where that comes in.
Hmm.
Because when you're saying to a child, no, you have to get up and get in the car now, you know, you have to go home now, it
Yeah.
doesn't work. And so it's there is a lot. I think the awareness is there, but I think there's still a lot more that needs to be put in place.
I think you touch quite nicely upon that all of these children and every child is very complex and there's lots of different parts to it. And again, it comes back to the diagnosis is not the one thing. You know, some of the children that we have, they may be a pupil premium child. They may also have a SEN need. They may be suffer. There may be some safeguarding concerns, for instance, and so all of that feeds into how that child presents. And I think one of the things that education needs to look at and be careful with is around which do we tackle first?
Mm.
Because we what we find kind of around us is that you want to be addressing the SEN needs because we feel that we can do that, but then you get past because there's a safeguarding need or it's a pupil premium need or it's opportunities and then you're passed around, then nobody is taking ownership and
Yeah,
accountability of this child.
yeah.
There's that element as well of needing to make sure that we are addressing all of it and as professionals being allowed to.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, this is what we had with him. I mean, we were at a point where, you know, his STEM need and his academic, you know, we had to put sort of way down because firstly it was safeguarding, you know, when he didn't want to be there, when he did want to take his life continuously, you know, when he continuously ran out of the school gates and me running after him, you know, onto the main road, which is a major safeguarding issue at the end of the day. But it's really difficult because, like you say, what do you do? But then there's this expectation from home is, okay, you know, no, but he's at school now. And I think the barrier there was that all, you know, parents were like, okay, he's in school now, he should be learning.
Yeah.
Because at home, we've got boundaries. So at home, he listens. So why is he not listening to you? Why is he playing up for you? Why is he not going to lessons? You know, all of this, but how can you send a dysregulated child into a classroom when firstly they don't know whether they're coming or going themselves?
I think that's also something that we find with staff. I think sometimes you can find within teaching that there are a number of staff that feel, well, the children are here to learn,
Mm.
and they
Yeah.
don't notice those signs of dysregulation. And actually, why is the child not learning? And there can be a frustration when, as a head teacher, I see a child dysregulated, I take them out, we co-regulate, we talk about
Mm.
what their issues are, I return them to the classroom. Now and again you get a teacher that comes back, well, why have I got them back? They've just, I don't know, knocked some books off of the bookcase, or
Yeah.
they've tipped a chair over, and it's like, well,
Yeah.
because now actually they're ready to learn. We've talked
Yeah.
about what was bothering them. Now they can access their learning. We can't exclude children from learning to punish them. That's the wrong way of looking at it. We're all in it together. And actually, if that, part of regulation and making sure that the child is able to access education is getting them back in the classroom as soon as possible. If we can safely and regulated, if they can access the learning, why are we keeping them out as a punishment? It doesn't make sense to me.
Mhm.
Well, no, that's it. But then that's when behavior is communication also comes into play because if they were in the classroom, something's happened for them to be dysregulated in that classroom at that time, you know. So it's, you know, like I say, we could go around in circles on
Yeah.
this for a long
But you have
time.
that awareness, and there's such huge variability in that awareness, which I think is one of the main issues, I think,
Yeah.
between different schools, between staff, between, just huge variability.
I would agree, and I think it's also around giving everybody involved in a child's life time, because I
Yes.
think as parents, you've already mentioned, Amina, that it takes time when you find when you start to realize, I guess that your child may have additional needs or a neurodiversity. It takes time for you to understand. It's the same in school. It
Mm.
takes time for us to understand the child's needs. And it's much quicker when you have staff that are willing to put that time in
Yeah.
than not. And certainly where we've been talking about early identification, I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important that primary schools in particular are kind of driving an inclusion model, because it's secondary, they've got different teachers for all the different subjects. They might be seeing lots of different teachers in a day. At primary, usually you are with the same class teacher who really does understand that child and can, over the course of a year, they almost become a surrogate parent to that child because they know them inside and out. They know what makes them tick, what doesn't, and then they move on to the next teacher. So that transition point is something that really we need to make sure is secure. And that's where, that making sure that we've got the paperwork behind that identification, that the relationships with parents we've already talked about is in place, means that they are successful every year of their educational journey and moves on. And that if we can get past the parents need to fight for provision idea, it means that schools also have time to learn about the child. And there needs to be an understanding on all sides that the school might get something wrong, parents get something wrong, but we're all doing it with the best interests of the child, and that we've got to give each other a break now and again.
Yeah, no, I fully
Yeah.
agree. And I think
Sorry,
as
can
long
I
as,
just ask?
Mhm.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you in there, Ari. Just a quick question for David. When we talk, just going back off the back of um, Ari's question of how could we better make inclusion, would you think that, if it means being better as a school and that, that collaboration between schools and parents, if there was more awareness in terms of workshops between schools and parents, then do you not think that would work better?
Yep, I do. I think there needs to be transparency in the systems, and I think there needs to be a way of us as schools being able to share with parents what are the systems that we're working within, what are the processes, um, what are what could the expectations be of where their child could get to, and almost that what are the best case scenarios and how working together would show that. I think case studies around real success stories would be useful. Um, and it's how that is presented. And I think something like this, where we're both from schools and we're talking to Amina from a kind of organization that's supporting parents, it's more around those sort of conversations, and it takes investment from all sides. And that's the thing is schools need to be invested to come and talk to parents and say this is the reality. Schools are finding inclusion tough, and
Yeah.
it's a difficult situation for schools in some cases. We have to accept that some schools are not doing inclusion well. So I can't sit here and go, well, if all schools are doing what I'm doing, and aren't we great? Because that isn't the case. And I'm sure there's some parents in my community that probably don't feel like we're meeting their child's needs.
Mm.
We've got 406 children on roll and 80, 86, 90 SEND children. We're not going to get it right all the time, but we need to all come together to say, well, we're going to try our best to get it right. And when we're getting it wrong, tell us we're getting it wrong. We need to
Yeah.
know. But also we sometimes have to provide those difficult messages to parents because I think there's nobody that will. And I think that's part of it is that, we can all work together with a EHCP application. It can go to the local authority and the local authority can reject it. That still makes it a them and us sort of thing, whereas actually we need to be having those conversations,
Yeah.
the local authority rejecting an EHCP. I've had one incident where the parent felt that that was us that had
Mm.
rejected it, and then that relationship breaks down, and that's very difficult then to come back from. We're still working with the children, we're still working with the family, because ultimately, one of the things that we haven't really touched upon is that when children move around schools and you lose all of that great practice and relationships that are being built up in one school because the parent has lost trust in the school to provide for their child, not meeting that provision, and then moves them. Now, I can give you a whole load of success stories of where a move to us, a move in from another school has been really successful. But also I can give you stories where children have moved out of our provision because they haven't felt that we were providing, and it hasn't been as successful when they've gone elsewhere. And I think that's the bit where we need to try and get this equal playing field for everybody, where all schools have an agreed universal provision, a bare minimum. And I feel that there is going to be more of that coming from the SEND reforms down the line, but also that it's not, what's happening in Yorkshire is different to what you get in the south of the country, and what happens in London is different to what's happening, in Liverpool. It's that sort of thing that we've got to try and find some sort of universal language, and that takes schools coming together.
Yeah.
And that's hopefully what we can see more of in future.
And I think that's why it's so important to have conversations like these, because then we can talk about what's not worked well, but also what has, and just talk about, like, learn from each other as well. And I think trying new things, trying new strategies, I think is so important. Thanks everyone for your time. It's been I wish we could keep chatting, but I know we're quite a little bit over in our webinar time.
Thank you.
Really appreciated everyone's viewpoints. I've learned a lot, so really appreciate it. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, David. Bye.
Thank you very much.